Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something truly fascinating. You know, if you've ever looked at a translated religious text and wondered, how exactly do scholars figure out what this really means? Well, you are in the perfect place. We're going to unpack the absolutely staggering academic and spiritual framework required to officially interpret the Quran. It's not just a simple translation, it's this incredibly intricate architecture of knowledge.
Which brings us to a massive question. In our modern age, we kind of have this tendency to assume that anyone with a smartphone, a dictionary, or a quick web search can translate and interpret an ancient, complex text. But who is actually qualified to interpret the divine word? The historical and scholarly answer is incredibly strict, and honestly, it challenges everything about our modern culture of instant opinions. Just to show you how seriously this is taken, take a look at this high-stakes quote from the Prophet Muhammad. He issued a very severe warning against what scholars call Tafsir bil-Ra'y, which basically means interpretation by personal whim. According to the foundational sources, just guessing at God's will based purely on your own unsupported opinion, that is considered incredibly dangerous spiritually. So yeah, there's absolutely no guessing game here. So before we start building this skyscraper of knowledge, let's lay down the foundation with two quick definitions. First, Tafsir. This is the rigorous science of explaining the Quran. And second, the Mufassir. That's the highly qualified commentator who actually performs this exegesis. Throughout this explainer, when we talk about a Mufassir, we aren't talking about a casual Sunday reader. We're talking about a master of multiple highly distinct sciences. Here is our blueprint for today. We'll start with the danger of whim, move to the linguistic foundation, look at history and context, then law, theology, and logic, and we'll finish up with the divine spark. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The danger of whim, avoiding personal opinion.
The crucial takeaway here is that scholars, particularly the renowned Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and his famous work Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Qur'an, established a rigid, multidisciplinary framework. The ultimate goal of a Mufassir is to understand the divine intention, but only according to human capacity. And to do that without falling into the trap of just voicing a personal opinion, a commentator absolutely has to master a highly specific set of sciences.
Section 2. The linguistic foundation, the base of exegesis.
This perfectly illustrates just how deep that foundation actually goes. A Mufassir has to master Nahw, which is Arabic grammar. But honestly, that is just the starting line. They also need Sarf for lexicography and word forms, and ishtiqaq to understand the deep roots and etymologies of those words. Then you add ma'ani for semantics, bayan to recognize complex rhetoric and metaphors, and badi, which is the science of linguistic eloquence. And to top it all off, they have to be fully acquainted with the specific idioms and the precise lexicon of the early Arabs.
Now, you might be thinking this is all just about sounding poetic, right? But it's really not. Without absolute mastery of grammar and semantics, the translation and the core meaning are instantly lost. Just one misunderstood word root or a misidentified metaphor can completely flip the theological or legal meaning of a verse.
Section 3. History and context, occasions of revelation.
You see, the Qur'an wasn't revealed all at once in one big book. If we look at this 23-year timeline, the revelations started in Mecca and later moved to Medina. This introduces another critical science known as Shan al-Nuzul, or the occasions of revelation. Verses are intimately tied to very specific historical moments, questions, conflicts, and resolutions across that entire 23-year span. Oh, and they also have to master Qira'at, the valid modes of recitation, because those different readings are essential for arriving at the true meaning.
So the key thing to remember is that knowing the occasion of revelation is considered a strict, necessary condition for interpretation. If a Mufassir doesn't know the exact historical background of a verse, like who is it addressing and under what specific circumstances, their entire interpretation can completely collapse. It leads to a totally wrong understanding.
A Mufassir also has to perform this massive balancing act. They have to perfectly categorize the text into what's called muhkam and mushtashibeh. Muhkam verses are the clear ones. They have a single, evident meaning, and they serve as the foundation for laws. Mushtashibeh, on the other hand, well, those are the ambiguous or allegorical verses that have multiple possible interpretations. Imagine the precision required to distinguish between a direct, literal legal command and a deeply allegorical metaphor. It's intense.
And it gets even more complex when we introduce Nasikh and Mansukh, the science of abrogation. The commentator must have full, comprehensive knowledge of which commands were just temporary stepping stones for the early Arabs, that's the Mansukh, and which are the permanent, abrogating laws, known as the Nasikh. Think about it. Applying a temporary, abrogated rule today would be a massive error in Islamic jurisprudence.
Section 4. Law, Theology, and Logic. Applied Islamic Sharia.
This is where the Mufassir uses the text to extract actual, applicable injunctions. To do this, they must master Usul-ad-Din to establish correct theological beliefs. They also need detailed fiqh, which is jurisprudence, and usul al-Fiqh, the actual principles used to deduce those legal rulings in the first place. And on top of that, they need absolute mastery of Hadith, the prophetic sayings, because the Prophet's own explanations and the sayings of his companions are actually the primary sources of exegesis.
But get this, a Mufassir also essentially has to be a philosopher. The sources explicitly state that logic and philosophy are essential tools here. They're used to reconcile verses that might initially seem, impossible according to human reason, or to address established scientific facts. The commentator has to harmonize the verses with the Hadith, making sure this entire massive intellectual system remains perfectly intact and contradiction-free.
15. That is the staggering number of distinct sciences Imam al-Suyuti outlines as the absolute bare minimum required to even begin interpreting the Sharia. To put that in perspective, today we might spend, 15 seconds skimming a search result to form an opinion, but a true scholar spends a lifetime mastering these 15 disciplines. Without them, anyone who dares to interpret the Quran is considered entirely ignorant of the principles of the text.
Section 5. The Divine Spark. Inspired Knowledge.
Now we finally arrive at the pinnacle of our architectural journey, because all the academic learning in the world is, ultimately, just one part of the equation. The sources speak of Ulum al-Mawhibah, which translates to inspired knowledge. This is a divine understanding granted by Allah, but specifically to those who sincerely act upon the knowledge they've acquired. It goes to show that academic rigor, while totally mandatory, has to be paired with deep piety. A true Mufassir needs both the heavy books and this divine spark. So let's bring this all together into what we can call the master builder's ascent. First, you start with absolute linguistic mastery. Then you anchor that language in precise historical context. Next, you process all of that through a massive legal, logical, and theological framework. And finally, through sincere action, you attain inspired knowledge. Honestly, the sheer brainpower and spiritual dedication required here is just awe-inspiring.
Which leaves us with this final thought. In an age where we can fire off an opinion on a super complex topic in mere seconds online, what can we really learn from the staggering, almost unimaginable rigor demanded of the true Mufassir? It definitely makes you view the act of reading and interpreting ancient texts in a completely different light, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.